The officers in the bunker stared at the chalkboard in silence. The number 500 was still written there, circled twice, underlined once, the product of months of intelligence work, guesswork, aerial observations, and wishful thinking. 500 B-29 seconds. That was what the Imperial General Staff believed America could realistically field. No more than that, they insisted. The bomber was too large, too complicated, too expensive. Even the Americans, with their industrial arrogance, surely couldn't produce such a monster in large numbers. At least, that's what everyone kept repeating. Colonel Araki remembered the meeting the previous winter when a junior intelligence officer cautiously suggested that the Americans might produce more than expected, perhaps 800, maybe even 1,000. The room erupted in laughter. An older general waved his hand dismissively and told the young officer that Japan understood American industry better than America understood itself. "We know their limits," the general had declared. "This story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Building B, 29 seconds, is slow, intricate work. Even the United States cannot summon thousands of such machines from thin air. The men in that room had believed it. Araki believed it too, until the morning when the reports came in one by one from radar stations, coastal observers, and terrified civilians that the sky was filled with silver shapes. Hundreds of them, then hundreds more, then more still. It wasn't 500, it wasn't 800, it wasn't 1,000. It was wave after wave, formation after formation, stretching back over the horizon like a moving wall of metal. And the most terrifying part was this: the Americans were not even sending their entire force that day. The first men who saw the bombers that morning were not soldiers, but fishermen off the coast of Chiba. They looked westward and froze. Even from miles away, the formation looked unnatural, a vast, shimmering line, low on the horizon, as if the sea itself had risen in a metallic wall. Some fishermen believed it was a mirage caused by the heat. Others thought it was a trick of sunrise. But the closer it came, the more undeniable it became. These were aircraft. More aircraft than any man in Japan had ever seen at one time. One fishing captain, a man who had seen every stage of the war, said later, "It was as if a steel curtain was falling from the sky." By the time the first alarm sounded in Tokyo, the formation had already grown into what observers described as a sky-filling mass. Pilots scrambled from their barracks. Anti-aircraft crews sprinted to their guns. Civilians hurried into shelters. But many of the air defense officers hesitated. The reports made no sense. They spoke of over 1,000 aircraft approaching, then more than 1,000, then 2,000. Some stations claimed they could see an unending formation, and headquarters dismissed it as an exaggeration. But by then, the truth was undeniable. The Americans had built a bomber force of impossible size. Japan's intelligence officers weren't stupid, they simply did not understand the scale of U. They assumed the B-29 to be like a battleship of the air, too complicated to produce in massive numbers. They believed the Americans would run into bottlenecks, shortages of aluminum, shortages of engines, shortages of trained crews, or even shortages of airfields big enough to handle the giant bomber. They based their 500-plane estimate on several key assumptions. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, sophisticated electrical systems, and R-3000, 350 engines were cutting-edge technology. Japan assumed production would be slow and difficult. Each B-29 required 4 massive R-3000, 350 double cyclones, among the most powerful piston engines in the world. Japan's own factories struggled to mass-produce far simpler engines. They assumed the Americans would face similar limits. A bomber crew was not like an infantry squad. These were specialists, navigators, radar operators, flight engineers, bombardiers, each requiring thousands of hours of training. Japan assumed the U.S. could not train crews fast enough. Japanese planners believed the island defenses would inflict enough casualties to force negotiations before the B-29 program reached maturity. Every assumption was wrong, and because they were wrong, the shock on that morning was total. What the Japanese did not know, what they could not have known, was that the United States had built an industrial machine of near infinite scale. When Japan estimated 500 B-29 seconds as the absolute maximum, the United States had already budgeted the resources to build 4 times that number. The bomber assembly lines were not built in one factory, but 3 giant ones. Between them, they employed over 100,000 workers, nearly the size of the entire wartime Japanese aircraft industry. While Japan was rationing aluminum, the United States was mining, refining, shipping, and shaping more metal per month than Japan could in a year. While Japan struggled to produce engines, the U.S. had whole factories devoted solely to R-3,350 production, running around the clock. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While Japan trained a few dozen bomber crews per year, the US trained more than that per week. And while Japan believed the B-29 was too complex to build quickly, the Americans simplified the assembly process until it was easier to mass produce than a pre-war civilian airliner. The result was staggering. At peak speed, the U.S. was producing 100+ B-29 seconds every month. Japan estimated 500 total because it assumed Americans thought like them. They did not. When the massive formation reached Tokyo, many of the Japanese fighter pilots simply froze. They had been briefed to expect several hundred bombers at most. Most flights they had intercepted before consisted of 100 or 200 bombers. But this was something else entirely. The sky was filled with engines, a deep, rolling roar that vibrated in the bones. The contrails formed white rivers across the sky, merging into a single storm front of vapor. One pilot, Lieutenant Takahashi, later said, "It felt as if the heavens had opened and an army of iron dragons was descending." Fighters launched from airfields around Tokyo, but for every fighter that rose, there seemed to be 100 American bombers. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs. But the bombers kept coming. The gun crews had been briefed to find the lead formation and focus their fire on the core of the group. But there was no core, just wave after wave, spread across miles of sky. The formation was so large that some anti-aircraft batteries fired, until their barrels overheated and still never ran out of targets. In the command bunker, Colonel Araki listened as frantic reports came in. "Too many to count more than 800. Impossible. There are at least 1,200. The formations are still arriving. We can't see the end of them." Araki looked at the map. Their pre-war assessments, their intelligence estimates, their assumptions, all of it was collapsing at once. The Americans had not brought 500 bombers. They had not brought 800. They had not brought 1,000. Some officers believed there were 3,000. And the terrifying truth was that they were not far off. When one included the reserve waves, escorts, and bombers from multiple bases across the Marianas, it was clear that America had mobilized a bomber force far beyond anything Japan had prepared for. While Tokyo's sky boiled with panic, the American crews saw something very different. From 30,000 feet, the world below looked peaceful, deceptively so. The haze of early morning partially obscured the city. Despite the scale of destruction from earlier raids, Tokyo still sprawled endlessly beneath them. Inside one B-29, the flight engineer kept his eyes on the R-3,350 gauges. Temperatures stable, turbos steady, fuel flow perfect. At high altitude, the engines hummed with a smoothness no Japanese aircraft could match. The crew worked with quiet efficiency. They had been trained meticulously, so meticulously, that even under the stress of combat, their actions felt routine. The B-29 was not a bomber. It was a system, a flying machine room, a technological marvel, a weapon of industry as much as warfare. And as the city grew larger in the viewfinder, The bombardier saw what the Japanese had seen moments earlier, an entire sky filled with aircraft. To him, it felt like a parade of floating fortresses. To the Japanese below, it felt like the end of hope. Back in the command bunker, the senior officers were no longer arguing about the number of bombers. They were staring at the implications. If the Americans could put this many B-29 seconds over Tokyo in one operation, then, one general whispered, if they can send this many today, how many will they send next month? Or next year? No one answered. The silence said everything. To the Japanese soldiers on the ground, the formations seemed to regenerate endlessly, as if the Americans had built a conveyor belt that fed bombers into the sky. And in a sense, they had. For every B-29 destroyed, 2 more rolled off the assembly lines. For every crew lost, 3 more graduated from training. For every airfield damaged, another was already being built. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a symbol of a nation that had turned its factories, workers, engineers, scientists, and resources into a unified machine. Japan had gambled that America was too slow, too soft, too distant, too complacent to build such a force. That gamble was gone, burned away in the glare of thousands of bombers over Tokyo. As the raid progressed, Colonel Araki walked outside the bunker for the first time since dawn. He looked up. The sky was streaked with contrails, white lines twisting, merging, and crossing like the strokes of some giant brush painting the end of an era. Even from miles away, he could see the endless streams of aircraft. They glinted in the sun like a river of silver. He felt something he had never felt before. Not anger, not fear, but understanding. For the first time, he understood the true nature of American industry, not the caricature they had taught in pre-war academies, not the outdated intelligence reports, not the hopeful wish-casting of generals who needed to believe Japan could win. This was the real America. This was the force they had awakened. He whispered the words he could not say in front of his superiors. We were wrong about everything. Colonel Araki stood outside the bunker long enough for the cold morning air to sting his lungs. The distant roar of engines rolled across the landscape like a continuous wave. It didn't fade. It didn't weaken. It simply went on, as if the sky itself had turned into a colossal machine. He could feel the vibration even in the soles of his boots, thousands of engines beating the air in unison. He had grown up with the sound of radial engines, Japanese fighters, old trainers, reconnaissance planes. But the sound above Tokyo that day was different. Larger, heavier, almost unnatural. For a moment, he didn't think of war. He thought of factories, of assembly lines, of workers he had never seen and never would. Men and women in American cities he had only read about. Wichita, Omaha, Detroit, Atlanta. The names felt foreign and distant, but the effects of their labor were right above him, eclipsing the sun. He realized, with a mix of awe and quiet horror, that he was hearing the heartbeat of an entire nation. Another officer approached, breathless. Sir, the western districts are calling in. They say more formations are appearing. They think these are from a different base. Araki's eyes slowly lifted again. A different base. Of course. America had not built one airfield in the Marianas. They had built many, and each one was large enough to launch more bombers than Japan believed existed. He turned back toward the bunker. Prepare a full report, he said. Every detail, every sighting. The officer hesitated. Sir, the generals may not want to hear it. Araki's answer was quiet. They must hear it, even if they don't want to. He walked inside, the smell of sweat and burning electrical insulation thick in the air. Officers shouted into telephones, argued over maps, scribbled estimates, crossed them out, wrote new ones, and crossed those out too. One young officer turned to Araki with trembling hands. Colonel, the latest numbers suggest, he swallowed hard. If these are accurate, we may be facing nearly 3,000 aircraft. The room didn't react with shock anymore. They had run out of shock. What replaced it was something heavier, something like resignation. Araki closed his eyes. Log it, and continue tallying. Thousands of feet above them, inside the sealed, humming interior of a B-29, the bombardier named Leonard Pierce adjusted his Norden bomb sight. The aircraft was cold despite the pressurization. Frost collected around the window edges. He wore layers under his flight suit, and still he shivered. But the view outside was unforgettable. He could see other bombers to his left and right, dozens of them, immaculate in formation. Beyond them, more. And beyond those, more still, disappearing into the haze. The scale was hard to comprehend even for him, and he was inside it. He spoke into his intercom. "This is one hell of a turnout." The pilot chuckled. "Command wants to make a point." Pierce tilted the bomb sight down toward the city below. Tokyo sprawled endlessly, a maze of wooden structures, narrow streets, industrial districts, and river channels. Smoke from anti-aircraft bursts reached high into the sky. He could see flashes of black puffs appearing beneath the formation. The Japanese guns were firing, but the effects were scattered and far below. "We're above most of the flak," the navigator said calmly. "Should be an easy run today." Easy was a relative term. Nothing felt easy with thousands of men firing at you from below, but compared to flying through German defences, this felt strangely distant, like looking at a storm on the horizon rather than being inside it. Pierce steadied his breathing. He had trained for this. Thousands of hours, endless drills, endless practice with the bomb sight. And though he felt a tremor in his hands, he knew his job. The intercom crackled. "Approaching release point in 2 minutes." Pierce centered the crosshairs. Above him, behind him, and to both sides, other bombardiers were doing the same. An entire sky full of precision. On the outskirts of Tokyo, Lieutenant Masaru Takahashi sprinted toward his Ki-84 fighter. Ground crews were already spinning the prop as he climbed into the cockpit. He strapped in quickly, pulled his goggles down, and signaled readiness. The engine roared to life. The aircraft lurched forward. Other fighters rolled beside him, each pilot knowing the odds, each knowing they were outnumbered before they even left the ground. But duty was duty. They took off in rapid succession, climbing steeply toward the wall of bombers. Takahashi's radio sputtered with overlapping voices. Too many getting readings everywhere. Climb to altitude, 9,000 intercept group heading west. Which group? There are dozens. Look to your right, look at the sky. And then he saw them. Takahashi felt his breath seize in his throat. The horizon was lined with silver, not one mass, but many, like flocks of metal birds, stretching as far as he could see. He pushed his fighter harder, but the Ki-84 struggled above 25,000 feet. The B-29 seconds were cruising even higher. He tried to climb into a better position, but every second he spent climbing meant losing speed. The Japanese fighters darted in, fired short bursts, and pulled away. But there were too many bombers and too few fighters to make a difference. Some managed to get hits. A few B-29 seconds trailed smoke and descended, but the overall formation was hardly touched. Takahashi made one desperate pass at a straggling bomber. He fired until his guns clicked empty. The bomber shuddered but continued flying. He pulled away, gasping for breath, and stared helplessly at the massive formation above. In that moment, he knew. This was not a fleet. It was a tide. At precisely 9:32 a.m., Leonard Pierce received the command he had been waiting for. "Bomb bay doors open." He heard the mechanical whir beneath him. Cold air surged through the aircraft as the doors opened. The bomber trembled slightly as drag increased. The city centered in his viewfinder. He steadied the crosshairs. 3 seconds. He exhaled. 2. His fingernails pressed into his palms. 1. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward slightly as the weight dropped. Pierce watched dozens of bombs fall away in neat, symmetrical rows. Other B-29 seconds released at almost the same moment, and the sky below filled with the glitter of falling metal. Thousands of bombs, dropping at once, like a metallic rainstorm. He looked down and saw the city rush up to meet them. The pilot called back, Bomb bay doors closing. But Pierce kept watching. Even as the aircraft began to turn, he saw the first explosions. Then the next. Then entire districts were swallowed in rising clouds of smoke and flame. Black columns thickened and merged into a vast sheet of destruction. It didn't look like explosions. It looked like the earth was opening. Civilians were already running before the bombs fell. Entire neighborhoods surged toward shelters, toward basements, toward riverbanks. Mothers clutched children. Elderly men staggered in the streets. Firefighters shouted orders. Police waved people toward safety. Few listened. Panic drowned everything. The first bombs fell in the industrial district. A factory erupted in fire, sending debris raining across adjacent homes. Glass shattered for blocks. The fire spread instantly, leaping from one wooden rooftop to another. In the heart of the city, a woman named Sato grabbed her daughter and ducked under a doorway as the shockwave from a nearby explosion blasted down the street. Dust and splinters filled the air. The ground trembled again and again as more bombs hit. One man shouted above the chaos, "How many are there? How many? How many?" No one could answer. The bombs continued falling, and the sky continued to roar. Colonel Araki returned to the operations room. The noise from outside seeped into the walls, the distant rumble of detonations. He approached a table where officers clustered around a radio operator. "Report from Minami Air Defense Station," the operator said. "Their estimate is 1,200 bombers." "Minimum?" Araki asked. "And maximum?" The operator swallowed. "They said there is no maximum. They can't see the end of the formation." Another officer approached. "We have visual confirmation from the eastern watchtowers. Additional groups continuing to arrive. We're running out of markers on the map." Running out of markers. That phrase struck Araki deeply. Not because they lacked ink or pins, but because they lacked the capacity in their minds to imagine forces on this scale. He felt an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. A general addressed the room. "We must remain steady. Japan has endured hardship before." But his voice cracked slightly, and everyone heard it. A junior officer whispered to Araki, "Sir, what if this is not their entire force?" Araki didn't want to answer, but the truth had been staring him in the face all morning. "This is not their entire force," he said. "This is simply what they chose to send today." The officer lowered his head. Araki looked once more at the crowded map. Red arrows, circles indicating bomber paths, black pins marking reported sightings. The board was full, and yet the sky was fuller. After the bombs had fallen, after the city was burning, the B-29s slowly banked southward. The formation stretched for miles, looping into orderly lines for the return trip. The sky that had been filled with thunder moments earlier became quieter. The bombers climbed, their engines steady and confident. Pierce leaned back from his bomb sight and finally let himself breathe without a schedule. His hands shook. He wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the adrenaline. The pilot spoke softly. "Hell of a sight down there." Pierce nodded, though the others couldn't see him. "Feels like we're rewriting something." "We are," the navigator said. "We've been rewriting it since 43. Pierce looked out at the endless line of aircraft beside them. "Do you think the Japanese expected this? All of this?" The pilot responded without hesitation. "No one could expect this. Not until they see it with their own eyes." Pierce gazed at the horizon. The sky that had seemed infinite earlier now seemed too small to contain so many planes. He wasn't sure whether to feel proud or humbled. Maybe both. Smoke blanketed the city. Entire districts burned uncontrollably. Firefighters formed bucket lines along canals. Civilians fled toward open spaces, choking on ash. The sun dimmed behind the smoke, and day turned to dusk. Takahashi landed his fighter at a nearby airstrip, skidding to a halt. He climbed out, dazed. Other pilots landed as well, some limping on damaged aircraft, others returning in silence. One pilot walked over to him and asked, "How many do you think there were?" Takahashi shook his head. More than I can count. More than anyone can. The pilot stared at the smoke rising over Tokyo. How do we fight something like that? Again, Takahashi had no answer. Colonel Araki walked out of the bunker after the raid ended. The sky was quiet again, but the memory of the engines lingered. He watched the columns of smoke rising from the capital. They looked like giant tombstones marking the end of an era. He whispered to himself, "We prepared for the wrong war." Japan had prepared for battles of courage, of spirit, of heroic sacrifice. They had prepared for close combat, for naval duels, for island defences. But they had not prepared for this. A war of factories, a war of production, a war of engineering. A war where sky and industry merged into a single, overwhelming force. He looked upward one last time. America had not sent 500 bombers. America had not sent 1,000. America had sent thousands. And Japan had no answer. He returned inside, knowing the truth that every officer now understood, but no one dared to speak aloud. The war had been lost long before those bombers arrived. Those bombers only made it visible. The first thing the men in the bunker noticed was not the sound of engines, but the silence between them. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakata, newly transferred from an anti-aircraft regiment outside Yokohama, leaned forward with his headphones pressed against his ears. His face looked drained of blood. "These patterns," he whispered. "They're wrong." Colonel Satoru Ishihara, the senior intelligence officer in the sector, approached from behind. "Wrong how?" Nakata swallowed. He had been analysing aircraft signatures for years, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this. "It's the spacing," he said slowly, tapping a pencil against the receiver. "Sir, these aren't single aircraft, not even squadrons. These are waves." Ishihara frowned. "Define waves." Nakata lifted the headset off one ear, his voice barely steady. "Sir, I'm hearing engine clusters, dozens of clusters, and they're coming from multiple altitudes. It means there are—" He stopped, because even saying the number out loud felt dangerous. Ishihara nodded for him to continue. Nakata exhaled shakily. "Sir, I estimate over 500. That made the colonel straighten abruptly. "No." His denial came too quickly. "Impossible. Our intelligence says America cannot maintain more than 500 B-29 seconds in the entire Pacific, let alone send them all at once." "Yes, sir. I know what intelligence says." Nakata pointed at the receiver. "But that is not what the sky is saying." The colonel stared at him, searching his face for a crack, some sign of exaggeration. There was none. The operator's hands trembled slightly. "If these engine signatures are real, then this isn't a raid." He lifted his eyes. "It's an occupation of the air itself." Ishihara felt a shiver crawl up his spine, a sensation he hadn't felt even during the darkest nights of the Guadalcanal retreat reports. "Record every signature," he said finally. "Pass all readings to Central Command, and prepare the bunkers." But those were empty words, spoken because they were the only words he could still say. Deep inside, the colonel knew something the others didn't. Japan could handle 30 bombers, maybe even 100. But 500? That wasn't an air attack. That was a mathematical event. A proof of something Japan had refused to believe. And that was when the second operator, Private Shimizu, lifted a trembling finger and pointed to the east. "Sir," he whispered. Ishihara turned. Through the long slit window of the operations post, he saw the horizon turn a faint, shimmering silver. It wasn't dawn. It wasn't glare. It was metal. Sunlight, glinting off aluminum, skins, thousands of them, stretched across the early morning sky like a second ocean suspended above the first. No one spoke. No one moved, because every man in the room knew one thing instantly. There were far more than 500. Captain Daniel Morgan of the 9th Bomb Group rubbed the bridge of his nose as he scanned the formation ahead. He'd been flying B-17s since early 42 and B-29s since 44, but even he couldn't process what he was seeing. Skipper, his navigator muttered, leaning forward in disbelief. That's Jesus, are those more superforts up there above us? Not just above, Morgan murmured. Below, too. His bombardier gave a nervous laugh. Feels like if one more group shows up, we're going to start stacking like pancakes. Stacking? Morgan said. Kid, we're already stacked. Because in every direction, high altitude, mid-altitude, low altitude, climbing arcs, descending arcs, there were B-29s, walls of them, columns of B to them. Endless, orderly rows shaped into an aerial armada so large it made the horizon itself seem too small. Morgan had flown in large raids before. 200 bombers, maybe 300 on a big day. But this was the sky-wearing armor. His radio operator, Jenkins, turned. Sir, am I crazy, or did I count over 150 planes just from the tail windows? Try triple that, the co-pilot said. Triple what? Morgan nodded. We're flying inside a carpet. Inside a what, Skipper? A carpet, Morgan repeated. A carpet of wings. Look around. Jenkins did. Slowly. Carefully. And then he understood. They weren't part of a formation. They were inside a continent, a floating landmass of aircraft stretching farther than any man could see. No one had seen anything like this before. No one had even theorized it. America didn't just build bombers. They built airspace. Back in the Japanese command center, Colonel Ishihara was no longer speaking. He was, staring at the sky with the look of a man watching his future collapse into dust. Shimizu, the young operator, whispered, Sir, what do we do? Do? Ishihara murmured. There is nothing to do. A harsh, metallic grinding sound echoed throughout the bunker, the sound of heavy doors being manually sealed from within. Every man instinctively reached for something, helmets, maps, pencils, paper, anything to give their hands the illusion of purpose. Sir, Nakata said hoarsely, I think you should see this. He pointed at the plotting table. The operators had mapped the incoming formations on the transparent grid board, tiny red marks representing every new engine cluster detected. The red marks had begun as dots, then lines, then dense spirals. Now they formed a blot, a single massive organism of ink covering nearly the entire board. This, Ishihara whispered, this cannot be correct. Nakata swallowed. I double-checked with Operator Ito. He confirmed. Tokyo's upper airspace is registering. Sir, it's registering more than 3,000 engines. Ishihara's throat went dry. 3,000? Yes, sir. The operator's voice cracked. 3,000 B-29s. But that is more than the United States has ever. He stopped himself, because reality was right in front of him. Everywhere. More than we believed they had. It wasn't just intelligence that had been wrong. It was the entire mental framework of the Japanese war effort. They had been fighting a nation of factories. America wasn't producing warplanes. America was producing gravity. High above, Captain Morgan squinted through the cockpit glass as the sunlight hit something to the north. What's that glint? His co-pilot asked. Morgan leaned forward, wiping condensation with his glove. Probably more groups joining the main body. But we already have the main body. Apparently not, Morgan said. Because emerging, from the haze like a fleet arriving over the curvature of the earth, were more B-29s, hundreds, no, thousands. Morgan wasn't a man easily shocked. He had flown through flak fields so dense they looked like solid walls. He had watched friends vanish into nothingness at 20,000 feet. But this made his chest tighten. He keyed his microphone. Base control, this is Raptor 2-1. Confirm total raid strength? Static. Then, Raptor 2-1, repeat? I said confirm raid strength. Morgan paused, bracing himself. How many birds in the air today? A long silence. Then the voice returned, sounding almost apologetic. Raptor 2-1. Command reports full strike count at 3,027 aircraft. Morgan blinked rapidly. Say again? 3,027 B-29 seconds, airborne. Morgan let out a stunned exhale. Holy! His navigator crossed himself. His tail gunner muttered, "We brought the whole damn country." No one contradicted him, because in that moment, it felt true. Tokyo's sky had become a geography lesson in American industrial power. The first wave high altitude glimmered like tiny white sparks against the upper stratosphere. These were the precision groups, carrying carefully calibrated payloads designed to shatter infrastructure. The second wave flew lower and denser, engines droning in synchronized thunder. These were mixed ordnance groups, demolition, fragmentation, high explosive. The third wave, lowest of all, were the incendiary units, the same ones that had leveled much of the city in March. Their bellies carried destruction of a different kind. And behind them, still forming on the horizon, were reserve groups. Japan had no concept for this. This wasn't a raid, it was weather. An atmospheric condition created not by nature, but by factories in Kansas, Nebraska, California, Washington, each sending pieces of sky overseas. Colonel Ishihara stared upward, the weight of realization pressing down like lead. 3,000, he whispered. A nation that can send 3,000 bombers at once cannot lose a war. No one disagreed. Even the most loyal young soldiers felt something inside them falter. Belief, hope, possibility. Because what stood above them wasn't an air fleet. It was an argument. A demonstration of scale so vast and overwhelming that it rendered all strategy obsolete. Japan hadn't underestimated America. Japan had underestimated physics. Captain Morgan's voice crackled over intercom. "Steady, boys, eyes sharp. We're entering the forward sector." "Skipper," Jenkins said, his voice tight. "What happens if just one group breaks formation?" Morgan didn't look back. He just kept scanning the sky, thousands of wings shimmering like silver fish in a massive shoal. "It won't," he said simply. "How can you be so sure?" Morgan allowed himself the smallest grin. "Because at this point, son, the formation isn't following us." He nodded upward, as if acknowledging something divine. "We're following it." It being the machine, no. The system America had created. Production, training, logistics, aerial refueling points, command posts, repair depots, routing schedules, operational doctrines. A bomber was a weapon. But 3,000 bombers? That was a civilization. In Tokyo's bunkers, alarms wailed. Papers were scattered, radios chattered in panicked bursts. The city was bracing for the largest air attack in human history, but the colonel stood motionless. "Sir," Shimizu cried, "should we evacuate?" Ishihara did not answer immediately. He was staring at the sky, at the horizon-spanning procession of aircraft that had materialized like a steel tide. Then he took a slow breath and said, "No, Private, we do not evacuate." The young soldiers exchanged confused glances. "We do not run," the colonel continued softly, "because there is no longer Pussa anywhere to run to." He looked at his men. "Gentlemen, today we face not an enemy squadron, not even a fleet." His eyes rose to the sky. "But an empire of air." Captain Morgan pressed his hand to the overhead glass. "All aircraft," he said into the mic, "prepare for initial split. On my signal." Then he stopped, because ahead of them, stretched across the sky like an infinite silver arch, were yet more bombers, more groups, more wings. It was impossible, and yet it was real. Morgan whispered, "Dear God, how many did we build?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. The number didn't even matter anymore. Only the truth did. Japan had prepared for 500, but America had sent 3,000, and for the first time since the war began, the sky belonged entirely to one side. The first bombs did not fall immediately. For several minutes long, Trembling minutes, the thousands of B-29 seconds simply moved, a coordinated leviathan shifting into its final attack geometry. Only the sound reached the ground at first, a layered, rising hum, like a storm front forming from every direction at once. On the streets of Tokyo, civilians looked upward, shading their eyes. They had grown used to air raids. They had lived through nights when the sky glowed hotter than any sunrise. But this sound was different. It wasn't a wave of bombers. It was the weight of the Pacific itself, carried on 12,000 engines. Inside the central command bunker, Colonel Ishihara stood over the plotting board as red indicators multiplied like cells in a petri dish. Operators were sweating, some shaking. "Colonel," Nakata said, voice barely steady. "The formations they're dividing. How many directions?" "Every direction," the operator whispered. The colonel stiffened. That meant one thing. The Americans weren't just striking a district. They were striking everything: industrial nodes, rail hubs, weapon depots, shipyards, housing blocks providing, factory labor. Japan's war capability was about to be torn out at the roots. Ishihara forced himself to breathe. Report altitude of first strike wave. 29,000 feet, and dropping. The colonel closed his eyes. They were descending. The rain was coming. Up in the lead formation, Captain Daniel Morgan watched the ground drift into clearer detail. The city was vast, sprawling, almost serene from 25,000 feet. He had bombed many cities. None ever looked peaceful once the bay doors opened. "All groups," he called calmly into the mic, "stand by for Phase 1. His bombardier, Lieutenant Reeves, hovered over the northern site. "Skipper, I've never seen a target this big." "It's not one target." "Then what is it?" Morgan scanned the horizon, stuffed with B-29 seconds. A conclusion. He wasn't being poetic. The sheer scale of the raid, the logistics required, the factories that forged it, the men who flew it, meant only one thing. The United States had reached a threshold where output itself was a weapon. It didn't matter how fiercely Japan fought, it couldn't fight a number this large. "Bomb bay doors," Morgan commanded. Opening. A long, mechanical whine filled the fuselage. Rows of gleaming incendiaries appeared beneath the belly of the superfortress, hanging like metallic fruit waiting to fall. Reeves exhaled. "God forgive us." "God forgives no one," Morgan said quietly. But he might understand. On the ground, air raid sirens began their low, shuddering cry. Mothers pulled children indoors. Fire brigades scrambled, though every man knew their water tanks might as well be teacups against what was coming. Then, for a moment, everything became still. Perfectly still, as if Tokyo was holding its breath. Then, the first wave hit. The initial bombs were high explosive, designed to tear apart roof tiles, shatter windows, and rip open the tightly packed wooden districts so the second wave could do its work. From above, they fell like tiny black specks, then like streaks of metal fire. And then a ripple. Then a second. Then a chain reaction rolling across the city like thunder breaking through stone. In the bunker, the ground shook. "We've lost power to several wards," an operator shouted. Fires reported in Shitaya, Honjo, Asakusa, the entire East District. But he didn't finish. Every man in that room knew what the second wave carried. Incendiaries. Colonel Ishihara had witnessed the March raid. The heat, the winds, the screams carried on smoke. But that was done with a fraction of today's strength. He gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. "How many incendiary units in this wave?" he asked. Nakata checked the latest intercept. "Sir, approximately 2,000 aircraft." Ishihara closed his eyes. 2,000 B-29 seconds. The term firestorm was too small. This would be a manufactured sun. Captain Morgan's altimeter ticked downward. His bomber's shadow slid over the city's rooftops. "Steady," he said. "Hold formation." Even now, the discipline was absolute planes maintaining spacing of only a few dozen yards despite turbulence from the rising heat columns. Reeves leaned into the sight. We're over target. Release. Morgan didn't look down. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.